Okay, slide it through. Watch the legs.
Got it. Connecting the shackle now.
Clear below. Ready for tension.
The weight of mercy. The morning air hung thick with humidity as Dr. Priya Nair stepped out of her land cruiser, her boots sinking slightly into the red earth still soft from last night's rain. 23 years of wildlife veterinary work across Southeast Asia had prepared her for almost everything from cobra bites to tiger maulings, from mysterious viral outbreaks to poaching injuries that defied medical logic. But the call that had pulled her from her bed at 4:47 a.m. carried a particular urgency that set her nerves on edge. Mature female Asian elephant. The voice on the radio had crackled through static, trapped in a mud pit, several meters down, severe abdominal distension visible. Those last three words had made her grab her emergency kit with unusual haste. Abdominal distension in elephants could mean many things, but given the season and the demographics of the local herd, her mind had immediately jumped to one possibility that added layers of complexity to an already dangerous rescue. Pregnancy. Now, standing at the edge of what the locals called the Devil's Bowl, a natural depression that became a death trap during the monsoon season, she understood why the ranger's voice had carried such desperation. The elephant was indeed trapped, her massive body wedged at an angle that suggested she'd been struggling for hours, possibly days. The mud had formed a vacuum seal around her lower body, and each movement seemed to sink her deeper. "How long?" Priya asked Marcus Thompson, the senior ranger who'd made the discovery during his dawn patrol. The British expat had been working these forests for 15 years, and the deep lines around his eyes told their own stories of difficult rescues and harder losses. "At least 36 hours, based on the tracks," Marcus replied, binoculars pressed to his eyes. "Her calf won't leave the edge, been trying to reach her with his trunk." Priya followed his gaze to where a young elephant, perhaps 3 years old, stood 20 meters away, his small trunk extended uselessly toward his trapped mother. The sight tightened something in her chest, not anthropomorphic sympathy, but the clinical recognition of a situation that could easily result in 2 deaths instead of 1. "Breathing?" she asked, already knowing the answer would not be encouraging. "Minimal, getting shallower. We need to move fast." The next hour unfolded like a military operation. The rescue team assembled with practiced efficiency. Dr. Amit Patel, the backup veterinarian whose steady hands had saved more animals than anyone could count. Chen Wei, the excavation specialist whose engineering background had proven invaluable in countless extractions. Sarah Mitchell, the American wildlife biologist who'd been studying this particular herd for 8 years. And a crew of 12 local workers who knew every path, every tree, every danger these forests held. The helicopter arrived just as Priya finished her initial assessment, its rhythmic chopping adding urgency to an already tense atmosphere. The pilot, Captain James Rodriguez, a former military man who'd found new purpose flying rescue missions, surveyed the scene with the calculating eye of someone who understood physics and probability better than hope. "We've got one shot at this," he announced, after examining the site. "If she panics during extraction, if the angles are wrong, if the mud gives way too quickly," he didn't need to finish. Everyone understood that wildlife rescue operated on percentages, not guarantees. Priya crouched at the pit's edge, her trained eye cataloging the elephant's condition. The distension was pronounced the abdomen, stretched tight beneath the mudline. The elephant's eyes, when they flickered open, showed the glassy disorientation of systemic shock. Her trunk, that magnificent appendage, capable of both delicate precision and tremendous strength, lay limp in the mud like a forgotten rope. "She's going into metabolic shutdown," Priya announced to the team. "Core temperature elevated, probably hyperthermia from the struggle and sun exposure. We need to sedate for the extraction, but..." She paused, weighing the risks. Sedation in compromised elephants was always dangerous. In a possibly pregnant one, trapped in mud, with existing respiratory depression, the calculations were grim. "What's our alternative?" Amit asked, though his tone suggested he already knew there wasn't one. "We don't have one," Priya confirmed. "Sarah, what can you tell me about her?" Sarah consulted her tablet, fingers flying across the screen. Designation F, 47 inches our study. Approximately 35 years old. Last calf born 3 years ago, that's him over there. She's been seen mating 22 months ago, which would put her near term if she took, Priya finished. The gestation period for Asian elephants averaged 18 to 22 months. The math was both simple and terrifying. The sedation process required precision that bordered on art. Too much, and they'd suppress her already compromised breathing. Too little, and she might thrash during extraction, potentially breaking bones or causing the mud to collapse. Priya loaded the dart with a cocktail of etorphine and xylazine, doses calculated and recalculated based on estimated body weight and condition. Chen Wei, she called to the excavation specialist. What's your assessment on the ramp? The compact man was already waist-deep in mud, testing consistency and depth with a graduated pole. We'll need to come at her from the northeast angle. The substrate there is more stable. But doctor, this mud, it's like concrete where it's dried and quicksand where it's wet. We'll need to work fast once we break the seal. The calf trumpeted a high, keening sound that needed no anthropomorphism to recognize as distress. Marcus and 2 rangers formed a gentle barrier, keeping the youngster from charging into danger while maintaining visual contact with his mother. The calf's behavior was textbook for his species, persistent attempts to help, increasing agitation, but ultimately governed by instinct rather than reasoning. Dart loaded, Priya announced. Everyone clear on their positions? The team confirmed, with swift efficiency. James started the helicopter's engines, the winch cables already inspected, and rated for 12 tons, more than enough for a 5-ton elephant. But physics in mud was unpredictable. The excavation team stood ready with shovels and high-pressure water hoses. The medical team prepared IV lines and monitoring equipment. Priya raised the dart rifle, breathed out slowly, and fired. The dart struck true, embedding in the thick skin of the elephant's shoulder. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, gradually, the elephant's head began to lower. The periodic struggling ceased. Her breathing, already shallow, became regular, if still insufficient. Sedation achieved, Amit confirmed, monitoring through binoculars. She's stable but critical. What followed was controlled chaos. The excavation team attacked the mud with scientific precision, creating channels for water to break the vacuum seal while building a reinforced ramp. Every shovel of mud removed had to be calculated. Too much from the wrong spot could cause collapse. Too little would leave her trapped. Chen Wei directed the operation with an engineer's mind and a conservationist's heart. "Water jet here," he commanded, pointing to specific spots where the mud's grip was strongest. "Careful with that side, there's a void underneath. We don't want subsidence." The locals worked with remarkable coordination, their knowledge of the land invaluable. They knew which routes would hold weight, which soil would crumble, which angles would provide leverage. This wasn't their first extraction, though the size of this patient dwarfed previous rescues. Sarah monitored the calf, documenting behaviors that would later contribute to the scientific understanding of elephant familial bonds. The young bull displayed classic signs of stress, temporal gland secretions, repetitive swaying, subsonic rumbles that special equipment could detect, but human ears could not fully perceive. These weren't displays of human-like emotion, but rather involuntary physiological responses to stimuli separation, unfamiliar activity, and the absence of normal maternal interaction. "Straps ready," James announced from the helicopter. "But I need to know she's stable before we attempt any lift." Priya and Amit had descended partway into the pit, their boots specially designed for mud work, their movements careful and deliberate. Up close, the elephant's condition was even more concerning. Her skin, where visible, showed signs of pressure necrosis. Her breathing was paradoxical, the chest moving opposite to normal patterns, suggesting possible pneumothorax from the pressure. IV access established, Amit reported, having managed to find a vein in the ear. Starting fluids. The crystalloid solution began its slow drip, each milliliter a small pushback against shock. But Priya knew they were racing against multiple clocks: sedation duration, physiological collapse, and the structural integrity of their excavated ramp. "We need those straps positioned now," she declared. "We can't wait for perfect conditions." The next phase required a delicate dance between human ingenuity and brute mechanical force. The straps, each rated for 5 tons, had to be positioned under the elephant's body without causing additional injury. This meant partially excavating beneath her, a dangerous proposition with tons of flesh and mud threatening to shift at any moment. Chen Wei and his team worked with remarkable precision, using specialized poles to thread the straps under the elephant's chest and abdomen. Every few minutes, they'd pause to let Priya and Amit assess her vital signs. The elephant remained sedated but stable, her powerful heart maintaining its rhythm despite the tremendous stress on her system. "First strap in position," Chen Wei announced, mud coating him from head to toe, making him almost indistinguishable from the earth itself. "Second strap." "Got it," came another voice from the other side of the pit. The moment of truth approached. James performed final calculations, accounting for weight distribution, lift angles, and the unpredictable factor of mud suction. The helicopter's engines increased their pitch, the downdraft sending ripples across the remaining water. "On my mark," James's voice crackled through the radio, slow and steady. "We're not yanking, we're extracting. 3, 2, 1, mark." The cables went taut. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the earth itself sighing, the elephant began to move. Inch by precious inch, her massive body emerged from its muddy prison. The vacuum seal broke with an audible pop, followed by a rush of water filling the void. "She's moving," someone shouted. Though the observation was unnecessary, everyone watched with held breath as 5 tons of elephant slowly rose from what could have been her grave. The extraction took 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. Twice, the operation had to pause when the elephant's breathing became erratic. Amit administered additional medications, walking the tightrope between maintaining sedation and preserving vital functions. The straps held, the helicopter's engines never faltered, and Chen Wei's ramp provided the perfect angle for the final pull onto solid ground. When the elephant finally lay on firm earth, covered in mud but free, a cheer went up from the assembled team. But Priya didn't celebrate, not yet. The hardest part might be over, but the most critical was just beginning. "Full assessment, now," she commanded, her hands already moving over the elephant's body, checking for injuries that mud might have hidden. What she found made her stomach tighten. The abdominal distension was even more pronounced than she'd thought. Placing her stethoscope against the massive belly, she listened intently, their faint but unmistakable a second heartbeat. "She's pregnant," Priya announced, "and from the positioning, I think she's in labor." The revelation changed everything. A trapped elephant was one challenge. A pregnant elephant in labor, having just endured massive trauma and sedation, was something entirely different. The survival statistics, had anyone been cruel enough to calculate them at that moment, would have been devastating. "We need to reverse the sedation," Amit said, already preparing the antagonist. "She needs to be conscious for delivery." "But the stress," Sarah began, "will be less than attempting to deliver sedated," Priya finished. "Set up a perimeter, keep everyone back, except essential medical personnel. And someone keep that calf calm, but away we don't need him interfering." The reversal agent worked quickly, almost too quickly. The elephant's eyes snapped open, pupils dilated with confusion and fear. Her trunk lifted weakly, testing the air, processing the chaos of scents, humans, machinery, blood, mud, and underneath it all, the familiar smell of her calf somewhere nearby. What followed challenged every assumption about natural processes and human intervention. The elephant, despite her ordeal, began the ancient rhythms of labor. But these weren't the powerful contractions of a healthy mother in a safe environment. These were weak, uncoordinated efforts from a body pushed beyond its limits. "She's too exhausted," Amit observed, watching the feeble attempts. She can't generate enough pressure. Priya made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone not versed in emergency wildlife medicine. We're going to have to assist, like a dystocia in cattle, but she trailed off. But scaled up to elephant proportions. But with a wild animal who had no reason to trust them, but with 100 things that could go catastrophically wrong. The next 2 hours redefined what the term difficult delivery meant. Priya and Amit worked with their arms, literally inside the elephant, manually manipulating the calf's position when contractions failed to progress the birth. The elephant, whether from exhaustion or some deeper survival instinct, remained remarkably still during these interventions. She would occasionally rumble low-frequency vocalizations that registered more as vibration than sound, but she didn't fight them. Sarah documented everything, her scientific training warring with very human emotions as she watched the struggle. The calf nearby had gone quiet, his young nervous system overwhelmed into a kind of shock-induced calm. The rest of the team formed a protective circle, keeping watch for other elephants who might be drawn by the distress calls, ready to provide whatever support was needed. "I feel the head," Priya announced, her entire arm buried to the shoulder. But the position? Wait. She closed her eyes, relying entirely on touch to understand what she was feeling. It's breech. The calf is breech. Breech presentations in elephants were survival sentences in the wild. The calf would likely suffocate before it could be born, and the mother often died from the complications. But here, with human hands to guide and reposition, with medical knowledge applied to an ancient process, perhaps the statistics could be defied. "Can you rotate it?" Amit asked, sweat streaming down his face despite the morning coolness. "I'm trying." There. Priya felt the calf shift, just enough to change the angle. "Now we need a contraction, a real one." As if the elephant understood, though of course she didn't. Couldn't her body responded with a powerful muscular wave? Priya and Amit pulled in coordination with the natural force, guiding more than extracting, their entire bodies leveraged against the massive task. "I see feet." Chen Wei called from his position. "Rear feet." "But they're coming." The rest happened quickly. Once the angle was corrected and the elephant's body remembered its purpose, the calf emerged in a rush of fluid and tissue. It was smaller than typical, perhaps premature from the stress, but it was whole. And for one terrible moment, it was still. "No breath," Amit confirmed, his fingers searching for a pulse at the junction of jaw and neck. "But there's a heartbeat, weak but present." What happened next would be told and retold in the local villages for years, though each telling would add embellishments that Priya would have firmly corrected. She grabbed the calf's trunk, that miraculous appendage that would one day strip bark from trees and caress its own offspring, and began rhythmic compressions, forcing air in and out of lungs that had never known breath. Amit supported the calf's massive head, keeping the airway aligned. Sarah found herself praying to gods she didn't believe in, her scientific objectivity temporarily overwhelmed by the sheer will to see this life begin. The excavation team stood frozen, tools forgotten, their faces masks of desperate hope. 1 minute passed, then 2. The mother elephant, despite her exhaustion, had turned her head to watch, her trunk reaching weakly toward her motionless calf. The 3-year-old male continued his vigil at a distance, his behavior suggesting confusion more than understanding. Young elephants had no framework for processing such events. Then, like dawn breaking, the calf gasped. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden awakening, no immediate vitality, just a small, shuddering breath that moved its tiny ribs. Then another, and another. Within moments, the rhythm established itself, the fundamental pattern of life, asserting its most basic function. "We have respiration," Priya announced, her voice carefully clinical despite the relief flooding through her. "Amit, continue monitoring. We need to watch for aspiration pneumonia. Who knows what fluids entered the lungs during that extended delivery." The next critical moment came quickly. The mother, despite her ordeal, responded to her calf's first weak trumpet with a vocalization that seemed to come from the earth itself. She attempted to rise, her massive body trembling with effort. It took 3 attempts and subtle human assistance, strategic pushes, that she probably didn't even register. But finally, she stood. The calf, meanwhile, was struggling with its own monumental task, standing for the first time. In normal circumstances, elephant calves stood within an hour of birth, their survival depending on mobility. But this calf had endured trauma before even entering the world. Its attempts were heartbreaking in their futility, legs splaying, tiny trunk, tiny being relative, it was still the size of a human arm, waving for balance that wouldn't come. Musculoskeletal weakness from the prolonged labor, Amit diagnosed. Maybe some hypoxic damage to the motor centers. It's hard to know without proper imaging. Will it resolve? Sarah asked, her scientific documentation temporarily forgotten. Impossible to predict, Priya replied honestly. We've done what we can for now. The rest, she paused, choosing her words carefully. The rest depends on factors beyond our control. Maternal care, the calf's underlying resilience, absence of complications, we can't yet see. As if to challenge that assessment, the mother elephant did something that required no anthropomorphic interpretation to understand. She used her trunk to help her calf, not with human-like intention, but with the instinctive behavior of a species that had evolved to support its young. She nudged, positioned, and steadied until finally, after 40 minutes of attempts, the calf stood on legs that shook like leaves in wind, but held its weight. The medical team maintained their vigil as the sun climbed higher, transforming the mud pit from a crime scene to merely another forest depression. IVs continued their slow drip into the mother. Antibiotics were administered to both mother and calf. The 3-year-old was finally allowed to approach, his behavior showing typical juvenile curiosity, sniffing the new calf, touching it with his trunk, then retreating to his mother's side. We need to move them. Marcus finally voiced what everyone was thinking. This location is too exposed, too difficult to monitor. And if complications arise, the logistics of moving 2 elephants, one exhausted and potentially suffering from capture myopathy, one newborn and barely stable, seemed insurmountable. But James had already been calculating. The helicopter can't lift both. Not safely, he said. But there's a veterinary facility 12 kilometers north. If we can get them walking, even slowly, we can provide rolling support. Walking? Chen Wei looked skeptical. The mother can barely stand. Then we support her, Priya decided. Literally, if necessary. We've come this far. What followed was perhaps the strangest parade ever to move through the forest. The mother elephant, flanked by vehicles moving at a crawl, took one ponderous step at a time. Every 100 meters, she would stop, swaying slightly, and the medical team would check vitals and adjust IV lines that had been rigged to portable stands. The newborn calf walked pressed against her side, each step an effort, but managing to maintain pace with its depleted mother. The 3-year-old followed, his presence seeming to provide some instinctive comfort to his mother, or perhaps that was human projection onto animal behavior. The science was unclear. Local villagers emerged from the forest paths to witness the procession. Some brought water, others, fruit they hoped might tempt the exhausted mother. Their faces reflected the complex relationship these communities had with elephants, creatures that could destroy a year's crops in a night, but were also revered as symbols of wisdom and strength. Today, those philosophical contradictions were set aside in favor of simple human compassion for struggling life. Her breathing's getting worse, Amit noted during the 5th rest stop. His stethoscope against her massive chest revealed sounds that made him frown. Possible pneumonia developing. We need to get her to the facility soon. The final 2 kilometers tested everyone's endurance. The mother elephant's steps became increasingly unsteady. Twice, she nearly fell, saved only by the strategic positioning of vehicles she could lean against. The calf, picking up on maternal distress through mechanisms science was only beginning to understand, vocalized continuously high-pitched complaints that needed no translation. But they made it. The veterinary facility, established 3 years prior specifically for elephant emergencies, received them like a trauma center receiving critical patients, which, Priya reflected, was exactly what they were. The next 72 hours would prove crucial. The mother developed the pneumonia Amit had predicted, her lungs struggling to clear the debris and inflammation from her ordeal. The calf, while mobile, showed signs of what in human medicine would be called failure to thrive, nursing weakly, sleeping more than typical, responding slowly to stimuli. Priya barely left the facility during those 3 days, catching fragments of sleep on a cot between rounds of medications and assessments. Her notes, meticulously detailed, would later contribute to 3 peer-reviewed papers on emergency obstetric intervention in wild elephants. But at the time, she was focused only on the immediate, the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next small sign of improvement or decline. On the morning of the 4th day, something shifted. The mother's fever broke. Her breathing, while still labored, showed the deeper rhythm of actual rest rather than exhaustion. The calf, as if sensing the change, began nursing with increased vigor. Its tiny trunk, which had hung limp like a forgotten thought, began exploring its surroundings with the curiosity that would one day make it a master of its environment. "I think we've turned a corner," Amit observed, reviewing the latest blood work. White cell counts are dropping, inflammatory markers improving, the calves showing normal neurological responses. Sarah, who had maintained her scientific vigil throughout, documented every behavior, every interaction. Her observations would later challenge several assumptions about elephant cognition and recovery, but she was careful to distinguish between what she observed and what interpretation might suggest. The mother's trunk touching her calf repeatedly could be bonding behavior, or it could be simple proximity response. The calf's preference for its mother's left side might indicate lateralization of brain function, or it might be coincidence. Science demanded such careful parsing of observation from assumption. By the end of the 1st week, both elephants were stable enough to move to a larger recovery area, a 2-hectare enclosure that provided natural foraging while maintaining medical supervision. The 3-year-old, who had been kept in an adjacent area, was reunited with his mother. His behavior upon reunion was textbook for young elephants. Immediate approach, trunk contact with his mother, investigation of the new sibling, then resumption of normal feeding patterns. No drama, no Hollywood moment, just the simple algorithms of survival playing out. Part 2. The territory of recovery. The rains came early that year, transforming the recovery enclosure into a muddy paradise that seemed to mock the very crisis that had brought the elephants there. Dr. Priya Nair stood under the observation platform's tin roof, watching water cascade off the edges while making notes on her tablet. 6 weeks had passed since the extraction, and the mother elephant, now designated F47A in the clinical charts, but whom the staff had inevitably begun calling Sura, had defied most statistical predictions. Her weight's up 12%, Amit reported, joining Priya under the shelter. His rain jacket still dripped from his morning rounds. The calf's gaining steadily too. Almost textbook growth curve now. Almost. That word carried weight in wildlife rehabilitation. Almost normal, almost recovered, almost ready. The space between almost and actually could span months or years, or sometimes never close at all. The calf, a female, the team had designated F47A1, but called Choti, had developed a peculiar gait. Not quite a limp, but a subtle asymmetry in her movement that suggested those critical minutes without oxygen during birth had left their mark. The veterinary team had run every test available: radiographs, neurological assessments, even an expensive MRI courtesy of a university research partnership. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. Some mild cerebellar abnormalities, perhaps. Some unusual neural pathways that might be compensation or might be damage. Time would tell, or it wouldn't. She's adapting, Priya observed, watching Choti navigate the enclosure's varied terrain. See how she's learned to use her trunk for balance in a way that's atypical for her age. That's not instinct, that's problem solving. Sarah Mitchell had documented hundreds of hours of behavior by now, her research notes growing into what would become a landmark study on neuroplasticity in elephant calves. She approached the platform, her boots squelching in the mud, carrying a thermos of tea that steamed in the humid air. The matriarch from the northern herd was here again last night, she reported. Same position, about 40 meters from the fence line, third time this week. This was the phenomenon that defied easy scientific explanation. Wild elephants, particularly females from the same regional population, had been appearing at the facility's perimeter with increasing frequency. They would stand for hours, sometimes vocalizing in the infrasonic range that the monitoring equipment could detect but human ears could not fully perceive. Were they aware that members of their species were inside? The scientific community remained divided. Elephants had been documented visiting the bones of deceased herd members, showing behaviors that suggested some form of recognition or memory. But active awareness of living elephants in human care, the evidence remained anecdotal. Has Sura responded? Priya asked. Minimal acknowledgement. A few trunk raises, some rumbling. But she seems. Sarah paused, searching for words that wouldn't anthropomorphize. Her attention remains primarily on the calf and her surviving juvenile, the 3-year-old male, whom the locals had started calling Ganesh, despite repeated reminders about not naming study animals, had shown interesting behavioral adaptations. Initially aggressive toward his new sibling resource competition was natural in such circumstances. He had gradually shifted to what could only be described as protective behavior. When Choti struggled with the enclosure's steeper sections, Ganesh would position himself downslope, creating a barrier she could lean against. Whether this was intentional support or simple proximity preference was impossible to determine, but the effect was the same. Choti moved more confidently with her brother nearby. Marcus Thompson arrived on his morning patrol, his ranger uniform somehow immaculate despite the weather. We need to discuss the release timeline, he said without preamble. It was a conversation they'd been postponing, but institutional pressures were mounting. The facility, while adequate, was never meant for long-term residents. Other emergencies waited. Resources were finite, and there were those in administration who measured success solely by release statistics. She's not ready, Priya stated flatly. The calf, especially. That gait abnormality could be a death sentence in the wild, or it could resolve with natural movement patterns, Marcus countered, though his tone suggested he was arguing a position rather than a belief. We can't keep them indefinitely. Define indefinitely, Amit interjected. 3 more months? 6? The calf won't be weaned for at least another year under normal circumstances. The debate that followed was familiar in wildlife rehabilitation. The tension between individual animal welfare and population, level conservation, between perfect outcomes and practical realities, between what they wished they could provide and what they actually could. These discussions had no villains, only people trying to navigate impossible choices with incomplete information. Chen Wei, who had stayed on as a consultant, despite the extraction being complete, offered a different perspective. What if we're thinking about this wrong? What if the goal isn't to return them to exactly what they were, but to find what they can become? His words hung in the humid air, mixing with the rain's percussion on the roof. It was a fundamental question in conservation. Did rescue mean restoring an animal to its previous state, or helping it find a new equilibrium? The answer came, as such answers often do, not through committee decision but through circumstance. 2 weeks later, poachers were detected in the southern sector of the reserve. Not elephant poachers. The increased security had made that too risky. But hunters, after smaller game, who had set snares indiscriminately. The wire nooses, designed for deer and wild boar, were death traps for young elephants, whose curiosity might lead them to investigate. The anti-poaching team's sweep found 17 snares in a single day. But it was the 18th, discovered by accident, when a patrol dog refused to leave a seemingly empty clearing, that changed everything. The snare had caught something, but not what its setters intended. A young elephant, perhaps 18 months old, hung suspended by its right front leg, the wire having cut so deeply that bone was visible. It had been dead for days. When the necropsy results came back, genetic analysis revealed the calf was from Sura's extended family group, likely a cousin or half-sibling to Ganesh. The implications rippled through the team like a stone dropped in still water. The forest that had been Sura's home for 35 years had become, in her absence, a killing field for the young. "We can't release Choti into that," Sarah said during the emergency meeting that followed. "Not with her mobility issues. She'd be snare bait within a month, so we condemn her to captivity because we can't control poaching." Marcus's frustration was evident. "That's not conservation. That's giving up. It's recognizing reality," Priya countered. "Sometimes the best outcome isn't the ideal outcome." The solution, when it emerged, came from an unexpected source. The Elephant Conservation Alliance, a coalition of NGOs and government agencies, had been developing a new model, protected zones within wild habitats. Not captivity, but not true wildness either. These areas, heavily patrolled and monitored, provided a middle ground for elephants who couldn't survive in unprotected forests, but didn't require full-time human care. The proposed site was 40 kilometers north, a 500-hectare area with natural boundaries, a river on one side, cliffs on another, that made monitoring feasible. It already hosted a small population of elephants, mostly older females, and their offspring, who had shown tendency to avoid conflict with humans. The habitat was good, water was plentiful, and most importantly, anti-poaching efforts there had been remarkably successful due to partnership with local communities who had economic investment in elephant tourism. "It's not perfect," the Alliance representative admitted during her presentation, "but perfection might be the enemy of good here." The transfer preparation took another month. Every detail had to be considered. Sedation protocols that accounted for Sura's previous trauma, transport vehicles modified for Choti's stability needs, medical support for the journey, and coordination with the receiving team. But perhaps the most complex consideration was psychological: how to move elephants who had just stabilized without triggering another crisis. The answer came through gradual conditioning. The transport containers were introduced to the enclosure weeks before the move, becoming familiar objects rather than sudden threats. Food rewards encouraged exploration. Choti, with the curiosity that would hopefully ensure her survival, was the first to enter voluntarily. Sura followed, maternal instinct overcoming wariness. Ganesh, displaying the skepticism that would make him a survivor, took the longest to accept the containers. On the morning of transfer, fog hung low over the forest, muffling sound and making the world seem smaller, more manageable. Priya administered the mild sedatives herself, just enough to calm, not enough to compromise. The loading went smoothly, each elephant entering their container with only minor encouragement. The months of trust building had paid off in these crucial minutes. The journey took 6 hours over roads that challenged even the specially designed transport vehicles. Priya rode with Sura, monitoring her continuously. The elephant's vital signs remained stable, but occasionally she would rumble those low-frequency vocalizations that suggested communication attempts. Was she calling to her calves, warning them, simply expressing discomfort? The science couldn't say. Arrival at the protected zone felt anticlimactic after months of drama. The containers were positioned at the release site, a clearing near a water source with good grazing and clear sightlines. The doors were opened remotely, removing human presence from the equation. Sura emerged first, her trunk immediately testing the air. The chemical signatures she processed in those first moments contained encyclopedias of information humans could only guess at. The scent markers of resident elephants, the vegetation types, the mineral content of the soil, perhaps even the emotional residues of previous elephant presence. She stood perfectly still for nearly 5 minutes, processing this new world. Choti followed, her asymmetric gait more pronounced on the unfamiliar terrain. She pressed immediately against her mother, seeking reassurance that was apparently provided through touch and infrasonic communication. Ganesh emerged last, his behavior showing the kind of environmental assessment that would serve him well in years to come. He explored in gradually expanding circles, always returning to his mother, mapping his new territory with methodical precision. The resident elephants appeared within hours, approaching with the kind of cautious curiosity that governed most elephant interactions with strangers. The matriarch, a 60-year-old female with a missing tusk from some long-ago incident, led the investigation. The meeting, observed through long-range cameras to avoid human interference, challenged assumptions about elephant social dynamics. There was no immediate acceptance or rejection. Instead, a complex negotiation played out over days. Parallel grazing at decreasing distances, synchronized movement to water sources, gradual trunk contacts that might have been greeting or assessment, or simple tactile exploration. Choti, despite, or perhaps because of her disability, seemed to generate particular interest from the younger females in the resident group. They would flank her during movement, their bodies providing subtle support that might have been coincidental or might have been something more. 3 months into their residency in the protected zone, something remarkable happened. Not remarkable in the Hollywood sense, no dramatic rescue of humans, no display of impossible gratitude. Instead, something quieter, but perhaps more significant. Integration. Sarah, maintaining her observations from a discreet blind, documented the moment when Sura participated in her first coordinated group defense. A pack of Dole's wild dogs had been stalking a young elephant from the resident herd. The adults formed the classic defensive circle, young ones in the center, tusks and trunks facing outward. Sura took her position in the formation as if she'd always been there, her trunk swinging in synchronization with the others. It wasn't thought or planning. It was older than thought, deeper than individual memory. It was the algorithm of survival that had kept elephants alive for millions of years, expressing itself through a damaged but determined individual. Choti's development provided its own form of evidence about resilience. Her gait never normalized the neurological damage was permanent, but she developed compensatory strategies that fascinated researchers. She learned to use momentum differently than other calves, building speed gradually rather than in bursts. She favored certain terrains that accommodated her movement patterns. Most remarkably, she seemed to develop enhanced spatial memory, perhaps compensating for mobility limitations with superior route planning. These weren't conscious adaptations, but the kind of plasticity that evolution had built into the elephant nervous system. The protected zone model wasn't without its critics. Some argued it was simply a large zoo, that true conservation meant accepting losses, rather than creating artificial safe spaces. Others pointed out the economic unsustainability the protection levels required were expensive, dependent on tourism revenue that could disappear with political instability or global economic downturns. These were valid concerns that had no easy answers. But for the elephants themselves, such philosophical debates were irrelevant. They followed deeper imperatives: find food, avoid danger, protect offspring, maintain social bonds. If the territory they did this in was smaller than their ancestors' ranges, if their safety came from human intervention rather than their own vigilance alone, they showed no sign of existential concern about it. 1 year after the rescue, Priya returned for a formal assessment. The contrast with that muddy morning of crisis was stark. Sura had gained probably 400 kilograms, her skin showing the healthy, dusty gray of an elephant in good condition, rather than the tight, shiny appearance of stress and malnutrition. Ganesh had grown into the beginning of adolescence, showing the first signs of the independence that would eventually lead him to seek his own territory. And Choti had survived. More than survived, she had adapted. Watching her move with her characteristic rolling gait, using her trunk for balance in ways that would be documented in textbooks, interacting with peer calves who seemed to accept her limitations without question, Priya felt something that wasn't quite professional satisfaction, but wasn't quite personal emotion either. It was perhaps what conservationists feel when they recognize that their intervention, imperfect as it was, had maintained a thread in the fabric of biodiversity. "She'll never be normal," Amit observed, joining Priya at the observation point. He'd been reviewing the year's accumulated data, preparing for the peer review process. Define normal, Priya responded. She's alive. She's integrated into a social structure. She's likely to reach reproductive age. In conservation terms, that's success. And in ethical terms, Priya considered the question. It was one thing to save a life, another to shape what that life became. They had made decisions for beings who could never consent to or understand those decisions. They had altered the trajectory, not just of individual elephants, but of the populations they would join. We did what we could with what we knew, she finally answered. The alternative was death. This is something else. Not wild, not captive, something new. The protected zone experiment continued, expanding gradually as funding and political will permitted. Other elephants arrived, some injured, some orphaned, some simply squeezed out of shrinking habitats. Not all thrived. An older male, rescued from a palm oil plantation conflict, never adapted to the restricted range and had to be relocated to a more traditional sanctuary. A young female, survivor of a train collision, died from complications despite months of intensive care. The successes were celebrated, the failures analyzed, and the work continued. Chen Wei, who had returned to his engineering practice but maintained connection with the project, designed new extraction equipment based on lessons learned from Sura's rescue. His innovations would save 12 elephants over the next 3 years, each rescue building on knowledge gained from previous ones. He never claimed the elephants were grateful, but he didn't need them to be. The work itself, the gradual improvement of outcomes, was its own reward. Marcus continued his ranger duties, but with new protocols developed from the crisis. Rapid response teams were stationed strategically during monsoon season. Natural mud wallows were modified to prevent the kind of trapping that had nearly killed Sura. These changes required no recognition from elephants, no anthropomorphic gratitude. They simply reduced suffering through human foresight, which was perhaps the only kind of grace humans could reliably offer. Sarah's research, published in the Journal of Wildlife Biology, challenged several assumptions about elephant cognition and adaptation. Her careful differentiation between observed behavior and interpretation became a model for ethical wildlife research. She documented Choti's compensatory strategies without claiming they represented conscious decision-making. She described the herd's acceptance of the disabled calf without attributing human-like compassion. The science was stronger for its restraint. The economic impact on local communities proved more measurable than elephant emotion. The protected zone created jobs, rangers, guides, maintenance staff, researchers. Tourism, carefully managed to minimize disturbance, brought revenue that made elephant protection economically valuable. Villages that had once viewed elephants primarily as crop-destroying pests began to see them as assets worth protecting. This shift wasn't based on sentiment but on pragmatic calculation, which made it more likely to endure. 5 years after the rescue, during one of her periodic visits, Priya witnessed something that required no interpretation to understand its significance. Choti, now a robust juvenile despite her persistent gait abnormality, was observed helping another elephant. A calf from the resident herd had become mired in mud, not dangerously, but enough to cause distress. Choti, with her intimate knowledge of mud dynamics and balance compensation, positioned herself strategically and used her trunk to provide support as the calf extracted itself. It wasn't heroism or gratitude or any human emotion. It was simply one elephant assisting another, using learned experience, the kind of behavioral transmission that had allowed elephant culture to develop over millennia. That's your legacy, Amit told Priya as they watched. Not that we saved her, but that she can now contribute to her species' survival. The monsoon season arrived again, as it had for countless years before humans walked the earth, and would for countless years after. The protected zone flooded partially, creating the wallows elephants loved, but also the hazards that had started this entire journey. The elephants navigated these challenges with their ancient wisdom, modified now by human intervention that had saved some and failed others. Sura lived another 15 years in the protected zone, raising Choti to adulthood and independence. She died naturally during a drought year, surrounded by the hybrid herd that had formed from rescued and resident elephants. Her body was left where it fell, following elephant tradition, and over the months that followed, the herd would occasionally visit the bones. What they thought or felt during these visits was unknowable, but the behavior itself was documented, adding to humanity's slowly growing understanding of elephant society. Choti survived to reproductive age and successfully gave birth to a healthy calf when she was 18. Her disability didn't prevent her from being an adequate mother, though researchers noted she remained closer to the herd's protection than typical mothers, perhaps compensating for her mobility limitations with increased social support. Her calf showed no signs of neurological impairment, suggesting the birth trauma hadn't caused genetic damage. Ganesh departed the protected zone when he reached sexual maturity, as male elephants do. He was tracked for several years via satellite collar, establishing a territory that overlapped with agricultural areas, but avoiding serious conflict through what appeared to be learned behavior about human patterns. Whether this was intelligence or simply successful conditioning didn't matter to the farmers whose crops he avoided. He lived until age 35, when he was killed by a train despite multiple warning systems, a reminder that conservation victories were always partial and temporary. The protected zone model, with all its imperfections and contradictions, spread gradually across elephant range countries, not as a solution, but as one tool among many, suitable for specific circumstances where traditional conservation had failed but full captivity seemed excessive. Critics remained vocal, pointing out that these zones were essentially admissions of defeat, that truly successful conservation would make them unnecessary. They weren't wrong, but they also weren't offering alternatives for elephants like Choti, who existed in the space between wild viability and captive dependency. Dr. Priya Nair retired 10 years after Sura's rescue, her body wearing the accumulated toll of decades of emergency interventions. Her final paper, published in Conservation Biology, reflected on the ethical implications of wildlife rescue. She argued that the measure of success shouldn't be whether animals returned to an imagined pristine state, but whether intervention reduced suffering and maintained genetic diversity for future generations. She carefully avoided claiming moral authority, acknowledging that future generations might judge current practices harshly, but she defended the attempt, imperfect as it was, to balance individual animal welfare with species conservation. The last documented observation of Choti in this narrative came from a graduate student studying elephant communication. Using new technology that could detect and analyze infrasonic vocalizations, the student recorded Choti participating in what appeared to be a coordinated herd response to distant thunder. The elephants, spread over several hundred meters of forest, synchronized their movements and vocalizations in patterns that suggested complex information transfer. Choti's participation was unremarkable. She was simply one elephant among many, responding to environmental stimuli with behaviors shaped by genetics, experience, and the ineffable algorithms of survival. This, perhaps, was the true success of her rescue. Not that she lived to show gratitude or perform some reciprocal salvation, but that she lived to be ordinary, an elephant among elephants, disabled but adapted, rescued but free within the constraints that modern conservation imposed. She would never know the humans who had pulled her from death's edge, would never understand the debates and decisions that had shaped her survival. She knew only the immediate, the taste of bamboo shoots, the comfort of mud on sun, heated skin, the infrasonic conversations with her herd, the weight of her calf against her flank. In the end, the story of Sura and Choti became part of the larger narrative of conservation in the Anthropocene, an epoch where human influence made pure wildness impossible, but where dedicated individuals still fought to maintain some thread of the Jolso, natural world. The rescue hadn't been perfect. The outcome hadn't been ideal. But in the space between perfect and nothing, they had carved out something valuable: continued existence, reduced suffering, and the possibility, just the possibility, that future generations might inherit a world where elephants still walked, even if the paths they walked were partly of human design. The protected zone still operates today, though the original rescued elephants have largely been replaced by natural recruitment and new arrivals. Tour guides tell visitors about the famous rescue of Sura and her disabled calf, though the story grows more dramatic with each telling. The scientific papers gather citations in the literature, their careful data contributing to the slow accumulation of knowledge about how to help wildlife persist in a human-dominated world. The extraction equipment Chen Wei designed has been refined through multiple iterations, each version slightly better at minimizing trauma during rescue. These are measurable outcomes, documented successes that require no anthropomorphism to appreciate. Elephants were saved who would have died. Knowledge was gained that would save others. Communities found economic value in conservation. Ecosystems maintained their megafauna, with all the cascading effects that entailed. If the elephants themselves had no opinion on these matters, if they continued their lives without gratitude or recognition, that was perhaps the most honest outcome of all. The rains still come each year, turning the forest floors to mud. Elephants still occasionally become trapped, though improved monitoring and landscape modification have reduced incidents. When they do occur, teams of humans respond with equipment and knowledge refined through experience, including the hard-won lessons of Sura's extraction. They don't expect thanks. They expect only what wildlife rescue truly offers: the possibility of continued life, the maintenance of biodiversity, and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from using human capability to reduce suffering in beings who will never know their names. This is conservation, without romance, without the comfortable fiction of interspecies gratitude, without the Hollywood endings that make complex realities simple. It is work measured in small victories and acceptable failures, in peer-reviewed papers and budget spreadsheets, in satellite collar data and infant survival rates. It is the story of humans and elephants sharing a shrinking world, negotiating coexistence through science and compromise, each species following its own imperatives while occasionally, accidentally, serving the other's needs. The protected zone's boundary fence requires constant maintenance. Poachers still probe for weaknesses. Funding remains precarious. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns in ways that challenge both human and elephant adaptation. These problems don't resolve with dramatic gestures or singular rescues. They persist, requiring the same persistent response: showing up, doing the work, measuring the outcomes, adjusting the approach, and continuing despite the absence of perfect solutions. In the early morning, when mist still clings to the trees and the world feels suspended between night and day, you can sometimes hear the elephants calling to each other across the protected zone. These vocalizations, below the range of human hearing but detectable by sensitive equipment, contain information we're only beginning to decode. They speak of water sources and food locations, of social bonds and potential threats, of the million small negotiations that constitute elephant society. Somewhere in those calls, Choti's voice continues, distinctive in its patterns to those who know how to listen, neither grateful nor ungrateful, simply present a testament to the complicated grace of survival in an imperfect world. The story ends where it began, with elephants living their lives according to their nature, with humans intervening imperfectly, but determinedly when that nature intersects catastrophically with the modified world, with outcomes that satisfy no one completely, but represent the best available compromise between the ideal and the possible. It is not a story of redemption or reciprocity. It is a story of professional competence applied to biological crisis, of conservation ethics negotiated in real time, of survival that owes nothing to sentiment and everything to science. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the measure of our intervention isn't whether the elephants thank us, but whether they continue. Whether Choti's calf grows to have calves of its own, whether the protected zones buy time for larger solutions, whether the knowledge gained from one muddy morning's crisis prevents future crises, whether, In the great accounting that evolution performs across generations, the genetic information carried by Sura and her offspring persists into an uncertain future. The elephants don't care about these questions. They care about the immediate leaf, the present water, the current threat or comfort. But humans, burdened and privileged with foresight, must care, must continue the imperfect work of conservation, knowing that success is temporary, failure is frequent, and the only gratitude that matters is our own for the opportunity to use our capabilities, flawed as they are, in service of life's continuation. This is the true story of wildlife rescue. Not heroism, but competence. Not gratitude, but survival. Not perfection, but persistence. It plays out in countless variations across the world, wherever humans with training and dedication meet animals in crisis. Most of these stories go untold, recorded only in scientific databases and budget reports. But collectively, they represent humanity's stumbling, imperfect, absolutely essential effort to maintain the biodiversity that makes Earth remarkable. The work continues,